Welcome, dear listeners, to the Midnight Screen Files. After a long absence, I return with a story, short, but I hope not easily forgotten. Tonight, we drift into the quiet corners of a small town, a place where grief is part of the landscape, where gardens bloom over old secrets, and where justice sometimes arrives in the most unexpected forms. So settle in, pour yourself something warm, and listen closely, because even the kindest faces can hold a darkness all their own.
I came home the summer the garden was at its most beautiful, though I didn't realize it at the time. All I noticed then was how everything looked a little too bright, like the sun was mocking me for thinking I'd left this town behind. It had been 6 years since I'd set foot on that cracked sidewalk. 6 years of convincing myself I was finished with this place. But my father died in June, and by July, I was sleeping again in my childhood bedroom with the pale green walls and the water stain shaped like an angel above the dresser. The funeral was held on a Saturday. The whole town turned up because that was what you did when a man like my father died. He'd been the sheriff for 25 years, long enough to be both respected and resented in equal measure. I stood beside my mother at the front of the church. She kept her hands folded so tightly I thought her knuckles might split open. I wanted to reach over and loosen them, but I didn't. She had always been proud of never showing weakness in public, and I couldn't bring myself to take that away from her. They buried him under the maple trees behind the church. People drifted past, offering the usual condolences in hushed voices. "I'm so sorry, Ava. He was a good man. If you need anything." I nodded at them, but it felt like they were talking to someone else. Miriam Kellogg was one of the last to approach me. She wore a neat, gray dress and a little silver pin shaped like a daisy. Her hair was pinned up in its usual careful twist, not a strand out of place. "Ava," she said, and her voice was soft and certain in a way that made me want to cry for the first time that day. "Your father was a good man, and you were a good daughter." "Thank you," I said. She smiled, a small crease appearing at the corner of her mouth. Cosmo was with her, as always. He was older now, older than most cats ever got. His fur had faded to a dull gray in places, and the left side of his face was scarred around the hollow where an eye used to be. But he still walked with that same slow dignity, like he knew exactly who he was and didn't care if anyone else did. "He still remembers you," Miriam said. Cosmo blinked his single eye at me and made a low sound in his throat. I reached down and touched the top of his head. His fur was coarse and warm under my palm, and for a moment I felt 12 years old again, standing in the dark behind my mother's garden, holding my breath. I stayed in my old room that first night. It looked almost the same as when I'd left. The pale green walls, the desk littered with old notebooks and half-dried pens, the narrow bed with the quilt my grandmother had sewn before I was born. Only the air was different, carrying the stale tang of time, like no one had breathed too deeply in there since I'd closed the door behind me. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. It felt wrong to be there again, wrong to be alone in that small square of space that used to feel like the only safe place I had. My father's absence hung in the house like damp air. Every board creak sounded like him coming down the hall, and every time it wasn't, a little more of the reality settled in. Sometime past midnight, I got up and went to the kitchen. I thought if I made tea, maybe I'd sleep. Instead, I sat in the dark, cupping the mud between my palms, listening to the crickets screaming through the screen door. That was when I saw Cosmo for the first time since the funeral. He was sitting at the edge of our yard, in the halo of the neighbor's porch light. He looked exactly the way he had that summer night, small, still, watching. Only now, he was old. And I was old enough to remember what I'd spent 12 years trying to forget. In the morning, I did what everyone in this town does when they don't know what else to do. I cleaned. I sorted my father's old papers, because it felt like work, and because it kept me from thinking too hard. I found the badge first, carefully wrapped in a piece of flannel. It felt heavy when I picked it up, heavier than a little metal star had any right to be. Then came the files. He'd kept them in neat stacks, organized by year and seriousness of the crime. Domestic disputes and DUIs on top, the darker things buried under them like sediment. It took me longer than it should have to find Boone's file. It was thinner than I expected, just a few reports, witness statements, a list of known associates, a single photograph of Boone scowling at the camera, all acne and bad attitude, as if the world owed him something, and he was sick of waiting for it to deliver. I closed the folder. I didn't open it again that day. The next morning, I sat on the back steps and watched Miriam's garden. It looked the same as it always had, green, orderly, full of life. She'd started it the summer she retired, back when her husband was still alive, and spent more time fishing than he did at home. I used to come over on Saturdays when my mother was working double shifts at the clinic and help her pull weeds. She'd always had a gentle way of talking to me, like nothing I could say would ever surprise her. Some part of me wondered if that was why I'd trusted her so easily. When Cosmo appeared that second night, I wasn't surprised. He came up the steps slowly, his claws clicking against the boards. He sat beside me and looked out at the street like he'd been keeping watch all along. I tried to remember when I'd last really looked at him. Looked into that single eye and let myself think about what had happened. But it was easier to pretend he was just an old cat who'd had a hard life. That pretending felt thinner every time I saw him. I think what finally made me open Boone's file again was the look in Cosmo's eye. It was late afternoon, and I was sitting on the porch with the file in my lap. Cosmo was stretched out a few feet away, grooming the white fur on his chest with slow, deliberate swipes of his tongue. He paused as if he could feel me watching him and turned that single eye my way. It was the strangest thing, how steady his gaze was. Like he remembered everything, down to the last detail, and he was only waiting for me to remember too. I flipped the folder open. My father's notes were sparse. July 23rd, no credible sightings. Talked to Rhett Fuller, story inconsistent. Colby Strickland claims Boone planned to skip town, but no evidence. Car found burned. Possible connection to Dominic Russo, known associations in New Jersey. No witnesses willing to come forward. I turned the page. July 30th, Russo returned to New York. Spoke to local contacts. Uncooperative. Community consensus, Boone crossed the wrong people. Mother believes he's still alive. Father resigned to outcome. Case remains open. Dominic Russo. I remembered hearing his name over and over that summer, from neighbors, from kids in the hallways at school. Boone was stupid enough to jack a car from someone connected. They found the car torched. That's how they send a message. He's probably in the river by now. It was easier for everyone to believe that version of the story. Easier to picture Boone disappearing in some big cinematic act of vengeance than to imagine he'd been buried a few yards from where he'd last picked on a 12-year-old girl. Easier for me, too. Until now. That night, I dreamed about Cosmo as a kitten. In the dream, he wasn't scarred or thin or old. He was just small and bright-eyed, mewing in the dark while I crept across the grass to scoop him up. But when I picked him up, he looked straight into my eyes and spoke in my father's voice. "It's time to remember, Ava." I woke up with the sheets twisted around my legs and the taste of iron in my mouth. I went next door in the morning. I didn't plan to. My body just moved like it was tired of waiting for my mind to catch up. Miriam answered the door in her gardening gloves. She looked surprised to see me, but not startled. "Ava," she said, smiling. "Come in." Her kitchen hadn't changed in a decade. The same checked curtains, the same worn linoleum, the same row of porcelain teacups, each with a tiny chip on the rim. Cosmo was on the windowsill, sunning himself. Miriam poured tea and asked about my job in the city, about my mother, about whether I planned to stay. I answered her in automatic words while my mind drifted. I thought about Boone and the way he'd looked that night. Not scared exactly, just surprised. Like it had never occurred to him that anything could happen he hadn't chosen. I wondered what he'd thought of in those last seconds, if he'd realized how many people he'd hurt, how many he'd made afraid, or if he'd died still believing he was the one in control. Cosmo stretched and leapt down, padding over to me. He butted his head against my knee and made that low, familiar sound in his throat. "He's always been fond of you," Miriam said, smiling gently. I reached down to scratch behind his ears. "He remembers everything," I said. Miriam didn't answer. She didn't need to. After tea, Miriam walked me out to the porch. The garden sprawled around us in perfect rows. Daisies and zinnias, snapdragons and marigolds, tomatoes heavy on the vine. It was beautiful. Too beautiful, if I was honest. Like she was determined to prove something with every thriving leaf. I looked at the beds along the fence, the ones she dug first when she retired. She used to say she liked that corner because the soil was softer, easier to turn. I wondered, not for the first time, if she'd known that would come in handy someday. I keep thinking about that night, I said, my voice low. Miriam slipped her gloves off, folding them carefully. She didn't pretend she didn't know which night I meant. Do you? She said. I think I always have, I admitted. She nodded like this didn't surprise her at all. I suppose you would, she said. Some things don't go away, no matter how much we want them to. Cosmo wove between us, his tail brushing my calf. I looked down at him and felt a twist in my chest. Gratitude. Grief. Something I couldn't name. He was hurting him, I said. Cosmo, he took his eye. Yes, Miriam said softly. I remembered the way Boone had laughed when the kitten screamed, the easy satisfaction on his face, like it was a game, nothing more. He would have kept going, I whispered. He would have, she agreed. A breeze stirred the garden and the scent of marigold and earth rose around us. For a second, I thought I might be sick, but the feeling passed. I never thanked you, I said finally. Miriam turned to me then, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't pity or even sympathy, something closer to understanding. You were a child, she said. It wasn't your burden to carry. I helped, I reminded her. You did, she said evenly. And you shouldn't have had to. I think that was the moment I realized she wasn't sorry. Not for what she'd done, not for what she'd asked of me. She was sorry I'd been there to see it, but not that Boone was gone. And God help me, I wasn't sorry either. After I left her house, I walked the perimeter of the garden. The sun was high, bright enough to make me squint. I stopped near the back fence. There, where the daisies grew the thickest, the ground still dipped a little. No one else would have noticed, but I did. I remembered standing in that exact spot with a shovel in my hands, too numb to cry. I remembered Miriam smoothing the earth when it was done, her hands steady. I remembered Cosmo tucked against my chest, trembling, the blood drying in his fur. That night I dreamed again. I was 12, walking the yard with bare feet, the grass wet and cold. I heard the mewing. I followed it past the fence. But when I reached the elm, Boone wasn't there. Miriam was. She stood in the shadows, her eyes on me, her hands folded. You did what you had to, she said in that same calm voice. I tried to answer, but no sound came. I woke up gasping, my heart stuttering. The next day, I found the ring. I don't know where it had been hiding all those years, buried in the garden, wedged behind a loose board on the porch. Maybe Cosmo had kept it safe, waiting for the moment when I was ready to see it again. He dropped it on the kitchen floor at dawn, then sat back on his haunches and watched me. The plastic was warped from the heat of a long summer, the cheap paint chipped away. But I knew it for what it was the second I picked it up. Boone's ring. I closed my hand around it and sat down hard on the floor. It took me an hour to work up the nerve to go next door. When Miriam opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She gestured for me to sit at the kitchen table. Cosmo hopped up onto the counter, curling into a neat loaf. I held the ring out to her. I think this belongs in the past, I said. She looked at it for a long time before reaching out and closing my fingers back around it. No, she said gently. It belongs to you. The kettle whistled. She poured tea, her hands steady. He was never going to stop, she said, her gaze on the steam rising between us. Not with you, not with anyone. I know, I said. He would have hurt more people, done worse things. I know, I said again, voice thick. She finally looked at me, and in that moment, I could see her exactly as she was. Not a monster, not a hero, just a woman who had reached her limit, who had decided that enough was enough. I don't regret it, she said quietly. I've never regretted it. I don't either, I whispered. After that, there wasn't much left to say. I stayed for another hour, listening to the cicadas and watching the light move across the linoleum. Cosmo slept with his chin on his paws, a slow, rattling purr vibrating under his ribs. I left just before dusk. I stood in her garden one last time. The flowers were taller than my shoulders, swaying in the evening breeze. It looked like any other garden to anyone passing by. But I knew. Cosmo trailed after me to the fence. He sat and watched me the way he had that night all those years ago. I crouched down and scratched the space between his ears. "You remember everything," I whispered. His one good eye closed, and for a moment I felt something in my chest ease. When I went back to my mother's house, I set Boone's ring on the kitchen counter. I thought about throwing it away, but I didn't. Some things are meant to be carried. The next morning I woke early and packed my bags. I didn't know if I would stay or go back to the city. I only knew that whatever happened, the garden would keep blooming, and Cosmo would keep watch. And Miriam, sweet, steady Miriam, would drink her tea and tend her flowers, and never lose a moment's sleep over the boy buried in the earth. And maybe, I thought as I drove out of town, that was the closest thing to justice any of us would ever get.
Thank you for joining me here in the hush between midnight and morning. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to Midnight Screen Files. There are more tales waiting, more secrets tucked behind ordinary doors. Until next time, remember, not everything that disappears is truly lost. Sometimes it's simply waiting to be found by the right eyes. Sleep well,